Okay, this is for if you need some review on section 2 of retrieval, remembering, and issues with memory. This is the information that you used for your memory rap or poem. And so if you need some review on this, this is what this video is for. So again, when we are doing remembering and we are thinking about memories, we're really thinking about long-term memory, and we need to be able to retrieve and to access that information. And it all deals with our retrieval cues, our ability to retrieve because something has been triggered in our memory. And that failure can come because we had inadequate or missing retrieval cues to really get that out. And we have many stored memories, but access to them depends on the cues that we have. And so elaborate rehearsal is really about that because it's all about the visual, about the auditory, about the meaning and the context and the mood, and all those things are connected that can be cues that will bring things into light. Now, common retrieval glitches, and we'll be talking about obviously the different issues with memory. One is called tip of the tongue, and we often get this. A lot of adults especially get it at least once a week. It's very, very common with older adults because memory is starting to be harder to access and cognitive ability. And that's just where you have you can't who's that actor in the Titanic? And you're like, oh my goodness, I know it's on the tip of my tongue, and that's why they call it that. But it's really the temporarily you're unable to retrieve something from long-term memory, and that is universal. All cultures use the reference to the tongue in their references to not being able to retrieve something temporarily. So we usually get some partial response, the first letter of a word or the number of syllables and so forth, and you can remember sort of the syllable part of it. And those all act as retrieval cues that you're eventually 90% of the time you're going to be able to resolve that cue. So recall is, or free recall, it's producing information with no retrieval cues, and this is much harder. And this is why sometimes essay tests are hard, especially when you have not gotten the questions ahead of time. We used to get essay questions in high school or college, and then they would pick one or two to put on the test. And I had, put together an answer for each one in a mnemonic that had all the information, and all I needed to know was the 6 letters, and if I got those 6 letters like written down, that I knew exactly what my essay was going to be about. It was a big elaborate rehearsal that I would do with that. But essay is really, there's no retrieval cues on that test. It's one essay, and you don't have multiple choice or fill in the blank or things like that where you have to do that. Okay, so this involves what we call, and these are really important words in this section, the serial position effect, that it's easier to retrieve from the beginning of a list of things, or it's called primacy effect, and at the end, which is called the regency effect. So it's better, for us to, the serial position effect has to do with primacy and regency, and it's better, we can remember things at the beginning and the end of a whole list of things, but it's hard to come up with the middle. So that's why performers tend to forget the middle of songs and so forth. A cue recall is remembering information in response to a retrieval cue. So fill in the blank or matching questions, and recognition is would also be something with testing retrieval, where you would identify the correct information from possible sources. So some of you really do well on multiple choice tests because all you need to do is be able to see basically the right answer, and then you'll be able to see it. You'll be able to remember that that's the answer because it has a retrieval cue of recognition, okay? But when we have recall, free recall, and it's a test where we have to remember information, we have to rely on our serial position effect for that. And so in a group of notes, you may remember the beginning and the end really well, but maybe not the stuff in the middle. That makes sense. So one of the best ways to access information is encoding specificity principle, and that is recreating the original learning conditions. So a tip, if you are doing your homework or reading something and learning about something, pick the same spot in order to do your test in. So the context effect, environmental cues are really a part of memory, and the mood also. If we can try to recreate, the mood in which you were learning that information, those become cues, the actual mood and the context of being there. That's why I always, when people come in for SRT, I try to get them to sit in their same seat that they take their test if they're making up a test, because sometimes that will help to retrieve some of the things that they've learned, okay, which is kind of cool. Now, some issues with memories come with the following. So flashbulb memories is a type of memory that we can have when we have a major event. So 9/11 was done as a study with Jennifer Taricchio and David Rubin from Duke University, and they had some students complete a questionnaire on the terrorism attacks of 9/11 and an ordinary event around the same time. So with these students, they did a longitudinal study of a week, 6 weeks, and 32 weeks later, and they tried to figure out what they actually remembered. And flashback memories are very vivid, they're very distinct, and they're long lasting, and people really think that they are real because they are vivid. And if we have a vivid dream, we almost sometimes, that's why deja vu sort of happens, is because it's so vivid, we think it couldn't possibly be incorrect, because if it's incorrect then it wouldn't be as vivid, but these are. And so flashbulbs and everyday memories decay over time, and so that's why there's so many inconsistent details that increase as time goes on. And that's what they found in this study, that the students perceived that their flashbulb memory was vivid and accurate, and that they sort of exaggerated their belief in the accuracy because they really thought they were vivid, but it really does decay and so forth over time, and that's what the study showed. So forgetting is really inability to remember. It's not a tip of the tongue kind of thing. It's the inability to remember what was previously available. It's however, not a loss of information, and that's what we learned from Herman Eberhaus. And in 1870, he does a famous study. It's really old, and this study is really good, and it really has lasted over time. And his focus of the study was how much information was forgotten at different lengths of time. And you can see that from his Ebbinghaus curve there, the forgetting curve, that we have immediate recall is 100%, and then as we go 20 minutes, an hour, and 9 hours, that percentage goes down to, in 9 hours, we only remember 40%. So he wanted to make sure they weren't using any chunking, any associations, because that would affect, long-term memory if they were chunking things. So he used nonsense words, 3-letter combinations like WIB and MEP that mean nothing, and so forth, at least to that person. And he would try to find something that wasn't an acronym for a place that they worked at or whatever it might be. So they were meaningless words. These people memorized the list of 13 nonsense words, and then they had to recall after a variety of times, like 20 minutes to up to 31 days they did that. And that's when he plotted this curve that's called the forgetting curve. And the result was that we develop a pattern of forgetting, and it has a smooth pattern of forgetting. Every mental content gradually loses its capacity to be revived. Much of what we forget is lost relatively soon, and then it kind of levels off. That's what you have to know, that the forgetting levels off. It dramatically decreases and then levels off, and so forth. The same information forgotten about 8 hours as a month. And you can see that from the curve. I mean, 20%, it doesn't matter if it's 8 days or a month, you're still going to remember 20%. So we don't forget things completely, okay? It also showed how we quickly forget. How quickly we forget depends on if we encoded it, if we somehow created some meaning, and how often it was rehearsed. Maybe the people learning the list of words actually put some meaning to those words, and that learning quickly, we actually forget soon, and that's really important for cramming exams. And so forth, that we're going to have this decay of information, and we know that. So we need many sessions over days and weeks to encode, so we review material. Now I know we go pretty quickly, but within a 2-week period, you have a lot of time where you can continue to review material, and that's really important. His results, though, were not very universal always. If information is encoded, testing can reactivate memory, and even though some of you may not study as much, maybe just taking the test, the multiple choice part of the test, you start recalling things that you learned with me. And so there's more of that, it's still, they see that gradual decay of information, but it's not always that we forget all the time. So why do we forget? So encoding failure is the number one thing, a lack of attention. We know that attention is divided, so if something didn't get encoded and so forth, this might contribute to what deja vu experiences are. If you do something habitually, like driving sometimes, and you can't remember that you're supposed to go to the store because you're just driving, and you act without thinking. There's no conscious choices, and so we end up like missing stuff, like inattention blindness. But we also miss stuff, and it doesn't get put into memory. Okay. Um, a deja vu is really interesting. I think a lot of you have questions on this, like why is it ESP, that kind of thing, and how psychology was explained. It was really about it being a memory issue. So it's a brief, it's obviously this brief familiarity we have. It was studied by William James. Alan Brown did a study and said 68% of people get deja vu, and younger people were seeing 95%. Tends to be people who travel, educated well, remember their dreams, more sensitive to their surroundings. So just somebody who's been around and has a lot of experiences and doesn't have the same memories or places they've been all the time. And so they've been to so many places that something can trigger that memory, and then they really think that they're having deja vu. So Anne clearly did a study with this and found that familiarity was caused when the features of the current situation triggered a sensation that matched the sensation of the old memory. And this is caused by source memory or source monitoring. We can't pinpoint where we knew this from, and so we just think that we've been there before, right? That source memory. And so really deja vu is most likely to source amnesia, that we don't know exactly where our experiences came from. Inattentional blindness, which is again from chapter 4, the form of code and failure, right? We're failure to pay attention to things around us. We're unconsciously processing stuff all the time. And so all of a sudden we feel like we've been somewhere when really it's probably because our attention's divided. And then some of it's from brain dysfunction of the temporal lobe, where we get some understanding of sensation and perception, so forth, not the parietal, the temporal with that. And so that's some of the reasons why they looked at deja vu. Now, why we forget, one of those is perspective memory. We often forget things we have to do in the future, okay? And it's caused by retrieval queue failure, but not encoding, okay? And so there's some things that we can do. We don't have the cues. And one thing, if you can't remember that you need to study for a test, because that's something to do in the future, you need a cue to do that. So write down a sticky note, write reminders. And so there's 8 suggestions that they talked about with trying to get to remember to do things. Put things in your phone. My daughter tends to put sticky notes all over her mirror, a computer monitor, Post-it notes, put a timer on to do things in short term. Leave a message for yourself. Use reminder apps. Anything that's going to be that retrieval cue, because that's why you can't remember. It's not an encoding thing. When you have a test in AP Psych, you remember that you have a test. It's just you need the cue to help you remember. It's not that you haven't encoded that into your head. Okay? All right, another reason why we don't remember is decay. It's not a primary cause, but it can contribute to it. New memories create a memory trace and have a chemical change in the body, and then there's a normal metabolic kind of process of the brain that erodes the memory, especially if it's not refreshed or retrieved and practiced and whatever, and it gradually fades out of memory. So there's some evidence that contradicts this theory, that it's going to just erode over time, and that's Ebbinghaus's theory that decaying stabilizes after a while. We don't actually forget everything all the time. The rate of forgetting actually decreases over time. It actually levels out. So that's one thing about it actually gradually fading. Research that information can be remembered decades. Sometimes something will happen and you will remember decades later. So how could decay theory be true if 25 years later you just all of a sudden remember from a smell that you have, that you all of a sudden remember, like being at a skateboarding place or whatever, because it smells something like rubber and it reminds you of that. Okay. And you need certain types of retrieval cues. If something was decaying, then the cues would not help with retrieval. And sometimes the smell and the sound and whatever it might be is that just that one cue that you need to remember something from a very long time ago. So decay theory is something that can be argued is not quite the way. Interference theory is another one for why we forget. There are types of interference. So it's caused by one memory replacing another. So we have two, retroactive and proactive, and you have to remember which one's which. Okay, so retroactive is where, and retro is like 80s. Okay, so with retroactive, we remember that the old memory is affected. Well, how is the old memory affected? When a new memory interferes with it. So always think of that. And then proactive, I want to do something so my new memory is affected by my old memory. So with retroactive, my old memory, and combination of a new locker is interfering with the locker of your bike that you already know. So that's retroactive. It's affecting the old one. For proactive, an old zip code interferes with a new zip code. Whatever's at the end, the new or the old, is how you remember retroactive and proactive. Okay? Old girlfriend's name versus a new girlfriend's name occurs in emotional arguments like saying Sally versus Jen or whatever, and that would be a problem. So that's a proactive interference. Okay, why do we forget? Also motivating forgetting and so forth. Do we consciously or unconsciously remember or not remember something? Suppression is a conscious. I am deliberately trying to forget something and turn attention to other things. Some research says that if one pushes the memory out of their mind, it could be less accessible than it had been. But for the most part, it's just trying to not remember that consciously undisturbing memory. Repression is really what psychodynamic, dream theories and things would, psychological problems type of thing, that unconscious, the blocking of something. And studies have shown that people are more likely to remember positive than negative memories. So it's those negative memories that tend to get more repressed than and this is very controversial in terms of repression. And we'll talk about the memory wars in just a minute. Versus it never occurs to it's the root of psychological problems because people really do repress their unconscious memories and so forth. So we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, imperfect memories. How do we get those, and so forth? Well, there's a few reasons for that. Memory has actively constructed and reconstructed during retrieval. So we even when we remember something, we even kind of manipulate it into so forth. So it can be for good reasons, but also for bad reasons. When we recall something, there can be errors and distortions that are actually related to it. So the misinformation effect is the effect that information after the memory affects what we remember. So they did a study where participants were exposed to a similar event like an accident, and then after delay, half of them received misinformation while the other half didn't, and then all tried to remember the events of the event. And what they found was post-event exposure to the misinformation distorted the recall of the actual event. Like people really thought something happened and it really didn't. And part of that can be source confusion as well. The true source, like source amnesia or source confusion, can be the source of forgetting, when a memory is, correct or not. So when you heard information, where and who you found out, what happened, imagining you did something you didn't do, and so forth. And that can be really confusing in terms of that. So the burglar study, you need to know, was one that was done with images of screwdrivers in a burglary. And then later participants read an account of a burglary with a hammer. And 60% recalled the hammer, and they were confident that this false memory was part of the original burglary. And because the source that they were used, the sources confused them. The one was the image and one of the sources was the written story that created and recalled something, and they thought it was very vivid and authentic, and it was actually very wrong, which is what a false memory is. Okay, and then also with imperfect memories, we have to talk about scripts, schemas, and so forth, and that leads us to some interesting studies as well. So schemas and scripts, you need to know the difference. Schema is a cluster of knowledge that we sort of plug in a pattern. Your brain likes to compartmentalize things so that it doesn't get super cluttered. And so it integrates information. So for me, phones have changed dramatically over time, but they still are in my phone schema. So I can look at a picture of a rotary phone, one with buttons, a cordless phone, a flip phone, a smartphone, and all of that is in my phone schema. Now, some of you have never, used a rotary phone, so that may not part of your schema or so. So that's all of that information is kind of plugged into a schema for me. The script is all the actions and behaviors that can happen in a common event. It's not like the knowledge, it's the actions and behaviors, okay? And that can kind of mess with how we know about things. So some of the studies they did about schemas and scripts that showed memory distortions was, for instance, the psychological professor's office. So students looked at a photograph and they were asked to then write down, what was in the picture. And what they ended up having was they put in there were many errors. They missed certain details, but then they filled in things that would be consistent with their schemas. Like they thought a psychologist might have a clipboard. Well, there might not have been a clipboard in the picture, but because their schema thought that they had seen something like a clipboard, and then they wrote down clipboard. So it was very schema consistent information, but it was missing some of the details that was actually in the picture. Now, in the study from University of Arkansas, the participants listened to a story about a guy named Jack and his activities, and they included details of things that he did that were consistent with the scripts, and some were not. Some did not match the story, and some went with just what they thought Jack would be doing, and what he was doing was washing a car. So what was consistent was that Jack filled the bucket with water. What was inconsistent that went with their schema somehow was that he sprayed the neighborhood kids with the hose. And the result was that people remembered the odd items or things not consistent with their schemas, which makes sense because it kind of stands out. And false memories were also of the things consistent with their schema. So they vividly remembered Jack rinsing the car off with a hose, but it was not in the story. Okay, so schemas are the things that were in the picture that they thought would match, and then what he was doing, the events, the scripts, okay? Now the last one was a study by Strickland and Keel, and they had participants watch videos showing athletes kicking, throwing, or throwing a ball, and then they didn't show the point of contact, like what was, who was getting it, and they kind of filled in what they thought made sense of who was catching the ball, or what was happening in the story. And so we use our schemas and our scripts to fill in what we think should be there, and sometimes that creates incorrect information. All right, also forming false memories. We have the study of Lost in the Mall by Loftus, who's very famous. She's our person that thought she drowned, or she found somebody drowning in Pickerel in 1995, and they had 24 participants were given written descriptions about their childhood, and 3 of the events actually happened and they were told by their parents, and 1 was a pseudo event. So it was one that was a false story that they thought their parents told the researchers. And some of them were, the false story was that the participants got lost in a mall. They were rescued by an elderly person and reunited with their family. And then after reading each event, the participants wrote down as many details as they could think about each event. And 2 weeks later, the participants were interviewed and asked about the 4 events as well. And 6 out of the 24 had false memories about the mall. And even after they were debriefed and told, okay, that was a pseudo event, they still thought that that was an experience they had gone through because it was so vivid to them. And so they did some follow-up studies too, where they had been saved by a lifeguard, knocked over a punch bowl at a wedding, all kinds of things. And people really thought that those, because they were fed that information, it came from a source that they believed, like their parents, that it actually happened to them. And then even neat was a large study by Slate magazine. They actually put in a picture of Obama meeting the president of Iran, and this had never happened. And then, 50% of the readers reported, so, oh yeah, I remember on the news when that happened, okay? We have to be really careful, not about news, but like, we need to be careful when we think that we've seen something, and have we actually seen it? Because a lot of times when that happens, where source information or retrieval is wrong or information, and we are so confident in our, that we have remembered something and we're actually really, really wrong. So that was the largest false memory study ever conducted with people, and it really was eye-opening that um, people really thought they saw that on the news, and they hadn't. They just saw a picture of it in Slate magazine. So some cool stuff. Okay, and then also forming false memories, we have imagination inflation, false familiarity, and suggestion. So with imagination inflation, um, it's the power of imagination. Because we're human beings, we have the ability to imagine, and we can be very confident that something has happened, and it's actually, we've created a false memory because we have been imagining. And then false familiarity is, how imaging or imagining creates a memory. We increase our familiarity because we've imagined it. The source confusion, we don't realize that it's been from imagining it versus reality, and then we blend fact and fiction, and then we think that something's real and it's actually been imagined. And then people have also talked about hypnosis and guided imagery and other techniques, and how sometimes that suggestion of something, later on we may pull it up and retrieve it, and we may think it's something that really happened when it's actually just a false memory. Okay, and then the last thing to talk about is to circle back on repression and abuse. And this is something that's really powerful for me as well. I worked at a women's shelter for people that were women that were abused by spouses or boyfriends or partners and stuff, and had a lot of flashbacks from sexual abuse. I had worked with a teenager whose parents had her in a cult, and she was physically and mentally abused by her parents and other people in the cult, and she was really interesting to talk with. And so forth. And when it comes to repression, I personally would agree that when something like that happens and it's that dramatic and it's that much abuse, that really, like, repressing those ideas, it's really, they may repress parts of the most worst things that happened, but they're not going to repress all of it. And I would say that's a consistent thing that I've seen in the field. But there's people that, think that that some people can repress things altogether. But I think when something is that dramatic, that would create PTSD and have stress like that, that it's something that we would remember. So the repressed memory therapy that people can use, if in fact they think they are repressing things, is they have them relive those memories of abuse to begin to heal that and bring out and work out the anger and intense emotions and stuff. And people may suppress it and try not to think about it. I think that happens a lot. I know that happens with the people I've worked with. But they do use different therapies for that. Hypnosis is one thing, dream analysis, guided imagery, intensive group therapy can help with that. And so all those kinds of things can help with the suppression or repression, depending on how you see that. It's very controversial, and that's what memory wars is referring to, that it's this debate. People think it's hard to believe that you could repress repeated abuse. Some might have amnesia from a certain traumatic event, but not all memories are of several years. Now, I will say with somebody with DID, dissociative disorder, or known as multiple personalities, they have amnesia for a certain reason. They won't remember something if their personality was not present at the time and they were, back inside, and not out. They may not remember that something's happening. That's completely different. Because it's not really the same person per se. So that can happen, and that's related to abuse. Recovering memories of false memories, people have said that suggestive part of it, that technique of therapy, can bring out things that may not have happened. So the APA has really put out some things and guidelines for mental health professionals to avoid creating false memories for people, because something could be imagined and it's not real, and your mind has the ability to create false memories because of that. Okay. Hope this helped, guys, to go through all this vocabulary and to get your memory working. Bye.